Hello.
Hello.
All right.
Hello, Jack.
Dan, what are we doing?
We are
God damn
once again on a Tuesday.
On a Tuesday? Oh, I see what you mean. That's like, no. We're reading more Capital, aren't we?
We are indeed.
We're back. This tome. Dan, because I always get it wrong, why don't you
We are.
tell us what we read?
I don't know. We're reading section 1, part 4.
Section 1.
What is the translation of the Fetishism of Commodities and the secret thereof?
Ooh. You know, I'll tell you what, Dan.
It's a wonderful, compelling title.
It is. And I'll tell you what, Marx was feeling himself in this, wasn't he?
He was having fun.
He was going
Having some
off
fun.
on this one. You tell he was very excited by this, and I got the feeling that when he finished writing it, he just put down his pen and went, God damn it, I'm smart. I'm a genius. Yeah, this one written very differently to the past Capital stuff we've read. Mm-hmm. And as our guiding light, David Harvey notes, there's a reason for that, and I found that very interesting. Perhaps. Maybe this is just hindsight saying the reason. But before we kind of get into all of the stuff that he's talking about, I think it's worth noting that this is written in a much less accountant style, I suppose, and it is a little bit more. Harvey kind of tries to play it up and being like, this is much more literary than his other stuff because he's trying to match what he's talking about, and because this is so immaterial and so kooky and crazy and whoa, dude, he's writing in a much more grandiose way. I thought that was neat. Feeling himself is the way I would phrase it.
Yeah, Harvey seems to suggest that it's just one of these tactics that Marx wants to deploy, where he just sort of changes his writing style over and over again. I mean, I have no reason to disagree with that, although it seems like a little bit of reading method into madness. Just a little bit.
He was excited. I think that's that comes across.
Yeah. Harvey also points out that this, in the very first edition, this didn't appear in the place where it currently appears. I think it may well have been an appendix in the very first edition and then was put in this place. But in the second edition, given that this book's probably had 1 million editions, probably means a year after it was published for the first time. So it's not. It is in its intended place, and we shouldn't look too much into it being a weird addendum that sort of sits out of step. Yeah. But it is a brief respite, or it is a respite. I don't know how brief. Yeah. In the otherwise
linen and coats,
in the linen and the coats and the various different forms of value and the accountant's style is disposed of in favor of a slightly more literary style. Yeah, there's a lot more necromancy and
almost wizards. There's magic. When he said necromancy and wizards, I was like, what? It's here we go.
Is this the Silmarillion?
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I've been waiting for this. So real quick, just to kind of maybe explain a little bit more as to why he was writing like this. This is basically commodity fetishism, and we'll get into what this exactly means, but it's the idea of our laboring activities do not take the form of really people interacting with each other. Once they get taken to the market, it takes the form of our social relations kind of take the form as relationship between things and not between people. But Marx basically says in order to talk about this, we can't talk about coats and linen because it's not a super material thing. He says, in order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. And I don't think he's saying that as a devout Quaker or anything. He's not saying that as a good thing. He's saying that since this is so immaterial and so crazy, if we want to have a metaphor, we have to look to something as superstitious as religion. It's oh yeah, fair enough.
He went a bit early 2000s, internet atheist. Have to look at something so dumb, stupid.
God. Yeah. Richard Dawkins.
I'm an atheist, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. Now you're just describing me when I was 13, Dan. So you're kind of insulting me.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah, by fetish here, what is meant is an object which is imbued with mystical powers. Mystical powers which have their origin in the activities of human beings, but are considered in the minds of these human beings to be properties of the object.
To have fantastical powers.
Fantastical powers.
Yeah.
The object in this instance, of course, is the commodity.
Yes. I will say the thing that made me understand what he means by fetishism, did you ever read Tintin? Dan, you were growing up.
I'm sort of familiar, but no, not in any great deal of depth.
There's one. It's called The Broken Ear, and it's all about Tintin traveling to like some unnamed country in South America and finding something called the Arumba fetish, which is like this little tiny wooden statue of a god or whatever. And it's supposedly like the tribes who like own this fetish like believe it to have these powers of like that like maybe someone in the Christian religion would believe like someone's finger, like some saint's finger would have. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be like, you know, oh, these primitive tribes. It's like a cross has fetishistical powers or or a commodity indeed, as you say.
A commodity which he says it could be quite easy to mistake as being something very trivial. And he's demanding that we look a bit closer to work out what's really going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the simple way that this is always explained, which Harvey kind of explains as being like the moralistic way of looking at commodity fetishism, right? Which is that like he uses the example of lettuce, which I thought was very funny, which was like when you go and buy some lettuce, you have no interaction at all with the person who grew the lettuce, who harvested the lettuce, who distributed the lettuce to wherever you're buying it. Really, the only interaction you're having is with the person who you're giving your money to. So in that sense, the relationship that we have between the productive forces and you like consuming isn't you and the person who made it. It's made the lettuce, harvested the lettuce. It's your money interacting with the lettuce, basically. These two commodities interacting with each other, which then kind of like has certain psychological impacts on you that Marx kind of gets into, more so about like people who try to explain it, like bourgeois economists, one might even say. But yeah. I think Marx is definitely trying to have a bit more of like a grounded, concrete, why does this matter? Why does this happen? Not the like, you don't know who's making your shirts, and that's bad, because that is bad, but that's not really like his point, right?
Yeah, it's bad, but it's a feature of the problem. It's not the problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not that we need fairer exchange or fairer remuneration or
fair
it's
distribution.
not that we need to take greater interest in, as much as we are perhaps into local production of certain sort of like
yes, we're into that
certain products for our consumption.
Broad beans,
quite. That's not the solution to the problem.
Yeah, it isn't like you don't have to shake the hand of whoever made your clothes.
Yeah,
that's not Marx's point.
Or even if it were the case, because he's also making the case that like he says at one point that it is known to contemporary science, by which he means, well, contemporary means the middle of the 19th century, and science means political economy. The so-called bourgeois political economists knew full well that the source of value in commodities was the labor that went into those commodities, but that knowing full well doesn't change the nature of the mode of production. Just by knowing, you cannot sort of change the nature of the mode of production. Similarly, just by shaking the hand of the person who produces the thing doesn't necessarily remove the commodity fetishism, which results from the activity of production being done purely for exchange. But I think it's also worthwhile bringing up at this point an argument that's you sort of discover in the David Harvey. And also I went and read a little bit of Isaac Rubin's book on Marx's Labour Theory of Value, because he starts that book with like 50 odd pages on commodity fetishism, or like sort of developing the idea, developing an explanation of Marx's analysis of capitalism largely hinging on the back of commodity fetishism. And what he says and what Harvey says is that it's very easy to mistake commodity fetishism as being something which results from Marx's analysis of capitalism, kind of thing. You could read it as, particularly as there is this step change in how it's written, you could read it as a type of mystification that results from how capitalism operates, rather than an essential mystification for the operation of capitalism itself.
Sure.
And I suppose the important part there is like, one might be inclined to think, well, it's the same as the sort of fair trade argument, I suppose, or the ethical argument for a different type of relationship to production, and that you couldn't remove the mystification and still have the capitalist mode of production, which is kind of what's being suggested by a fairer trade system, kind of thing. Yeah, what Marx is calling the fetishism of commodities is essential to the nature of commodity production. Under capitalism. Yeah,
absolutely. And it really kind of made a lot of things click for me when he talks about just what this does to everyone's ideas around the economy. Like when you go to buy something and you're like, oh, the price has gone up. All these price fluctuations. It must clearly, just because my money is the only like really interaction I have with that change in value of these different goods is my money interacting with the lettuce that I'm buying. So clearly it must just be a price point problem with supply and demand. That's the only thing that could possibly be making these fluctuations in the price and the value. When Marx is saying no, it's like underlying like fluctuations in the actual value of something, and that like because this is all mystified from your point of view, you just see these two commodities interacting, you don't see the actual productive process, then that just basically, yeah, it does exactly what I've said. It makes it so that you don't see any of the productive processes happening, and you don't see how the underlying like value is changing because you aren't having a social interaction with anything beyond these two commodities just interacting with each other. And I thought that was really funny because it's like, wow, that's what every like modern economist like thinks. It's like that's what everyone calling themselves an economist, from like, you know, like Ben Shapiro all the way to like, you know, the like Milton Friedmans of the world or something like that. It's just, it takes labor completely out of the equation, and it's just basically just, it's simple supply and demand. It's Econ 101.
Yeah,
that's
it's
what
the
you're
analysis
taught.
it's what Marx talks about is the analysis of price, which is the sort of primary concern of bourgeois political economy, as he's describing it here.
I mean that even finds its way into debates about planned economies, right? Because it's so many like orthodox economists will go, well, you kind of can't have a planned economy without some kind of price point. You need a price point to determine the value of these goods. And like, that's such a big point behind commodity fetishism, is that it's like, no. You're being, this is all a mystification because you don't actually see what's going on. That's not true. You don't, you know, to extrapolate from this, you don't need a price point to determine like fluctuations with supply and demand. To extrapolate a little bit further from there.
True. It's true.
I'm just going to make a quick point too, just about how depressing it is. The general idea of like you not being able to know the value of your labor, the true value of your labor, until that product is taken to the market for exchange. That depressed me so much. It's like, God, as if I couldn't be more alienated. I can only understand what the value of my labor is until the product is just taken to the market, you know, till the exchange actually happens. I was just like, that sucks. That makes me, jeez.
I suppose to link this idea of commodity fetishism to what has already preceded in the rest of the analysis in the other sections of Capital, this fetishism of commodities results from the distinction between use value and exchange value in a lot of ways, and also the distinction between abstract and concrete labor, and also the result of the various different things that underlie forms of exchange which underlie exchange value that we saw in section 3. It's all about explaining this process of abstraction from the sort of like concrete activity of making a product and the production of the useful qualities of that product that are part of the concrete labor and the use value that results, and the process whereby what becomes essential to the capitalist mode of production is not the usefulness of the products and the material labor that's gone into them, the concrete labor that's gone into them, but the exchange value of the products and the quantity of abstract labor that's gone into them. And therefore you get to this point where you lose sight of the fact that what's being compared in the products of exchange is the quantity of labor that's gone into them, and rather what you just see is their ability to exchange and the rates for which they exchange being something which is mistaken as being a product or a quality of the commodity itself, kind of thing. So that is to sort of to underline how much the fetishism of commodities is essential to, or is the essential next step in Marx explaining his understanding of capitalism, kind of thing, and not something that's sort of like divorced from it, I suppose. Maybe I'll read this. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labour as soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. So there we go. The fetishism of commodities is inseparable from the production of commodities in a capitalist economy. And as we know, like, the production of commodities is the production of commodities for exchange rather than for personal use or even social use, I suppose. Because he does go on to try and explain in one of those rare moments of that Marx doing that thing which we're told he never does, which is explain what socialism might be. He does go on to try and extrapolate a sort of like a vision of production, which is production for use, but not for individuals, but sort of like a social production, rather than a personal individual one.
I mean,
that's to jump ahead a little bit.
I suppose that's just kind of worth repeating. That's just the basic point of like this. One of the biggest issues with capitalism is just the abstraction of like use value is not entirely connected, obviously. And I mean, this is what he's been saying in his entire analysis of commodities. Use value of a commodity is not like the determining factor of its value. And I mean, that's fairly obvious, but when you kind of like get that disconnect, obviously you wind up with things like fossil fuels being produced well past when they should, and the opposite end of that, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that's lost, or the other pertinent phrase, and the thing which is lost in this process, is the idea that there are social relations which underlay market exchange. Which is basically just another way of sort of phrasing what we've already talked about, kind of thing. But what I suppose socialists might be keen to emphasize is that there ought to put back in picture, I suppose, that there are these sort of material social relations which underlie commodities, kind of thing. And it's, I suppose, through this mystification, one might also lose sight of all the social ills that result from this process of production of commodities, kind of thing. We would want to say that it is the, I mean, I was about to say something. I was about to say we would want to say that it is in fact the fault of the commodities that there are inhuman social relations which produce them. But that would be a form of commodity fetishism, wouldn't it?
I'm going to kick the ass of every commodity I see.
To imbue the commodity with that power of sort of like subjugating us, kind of thing. But at the same time, by like, I suppose I'm slipping into the ethical argument here, so maybe this is just incorrect, right? But but we do want to have space for an ethical argument.
Absolutely.
Right? It's only that there isn't a resolution for the ethics, the terrible ends of capitalism, which would fall foul of our ethics. There isn't a solution for those internal to the capitalist mode of production, kind of thing.
Exactly.
That result from the capitalist mode of production. And we through this process of commodity fetishism, you can lose sight of the social ills of capitalism, or at least how the social ills of capitalism result from this process of running an economy purely for the production of commodities.
Well, and I mean, what's the capitalist like liberal solution to commodity fetishism? It's what you like alluded to earlier. It's like the fair trade idea, where it's like, okay, I know the coffee that I drink is destroying the rainforest. I know that the people who make it are like under borderline slave conditions. I know it's all horrible. Blah 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 blah. What can we do to make the consumers feel better about it? We'll just slap a sticker on there that says fair trade. Trust us. The people who are making this, it's fair trade. Don't worry about it. And that's like a way of bending your mind to get around this idea of commodity fetishism by just being like, oh well, the company solved it for me. Well done. No more commodity fetishism. But clearly that's obviously not solving, that's like slapping a band-aid on a much bigger problem. The bigger problem being this alienation from the actual work, our product, basically, and the products that we consume. We have no idea who's making them, no idea who's doing what. And that's kind of where it gets into these like psychological implications of what that does to people under a capitalist mode of production, which are like so grand that I think potentially not even going to comment on that right now. There are many, basically, to say that when you don't have any idea where anything's coming from, you don't know who's producing it, that does something to you. And it does something to you, even, if that's your job, if you have a productive job. So,
there's another quote here which kind of underlies that argument we were making, or I was making, about commodity fetishism not being a peculiar mystification, but in actual fact an essential part of the capitalist mode of production. He says, therefore, the relations connecting the labour of one individual with that of the rest appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but, and then the crucial bit, as they really are, material relations between persons, i.e. the material relations between people that actually happen in the workplace, and social relations between things. And so there's this distinction between there is a materiality to the activity of production which produces the use values, but what has come to take the place of what might be ethical social relations between individuals in a community of like a community of producers, I suppose.
Free and equal producers,
as you say. We're only interested instead in the what appear as social relations between things, which is what you were saying before, like the fluctuation of prices, which are actually have their basis in those material social the material relations of production, seem to be relationships which well, I suppose like by social relations between things, what he means perhaps, and what I understand him to be saying is that the only things that actually have any relationality to one another, the only social world that counts is the social world that exists between commodities as they trade for each other. And we have no interest in the social world of the relationship between human beings, which is the basis of that activity.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, our council communist friends would solve this through their kind of discussion of the right of disposal, right? Which I don't think I feel like I fully understand enough to fully comment on it right now. But suffice it to say that I think that the council communists we've been talking about a little bit recently would frame this as an idea of the workers need to have the right of disposal of the commodity that they create or the product that they create. Which you see, like, well, they'd be saying that certainly a lot in this section. Interesting, right at the end, Harvey talks a little bit about like liberty and about this idea of market forces basically determining so much of our lives, and to what extent can true individual liberty be realized by, some sort of socialist order that gets rid of this idea of commodity fetishism. And I thought that was interesting, just framing it in the idea of liberty, because he's basically making the point that like once you think that, it's all just a price point problem, it's all just these commodities interacting with each other, and you don't actually see any of the productive process or anything like that, like it does take away quite a bit of your liberty. I don't know if I have much to comment on that other than that framing this commodity fetishism as like a idea of freedom and of liberty, I kind of thought was interesting. He really only uses a couple sentences to talk about it right at the end, but that idea of like this mystification as like destroying some part of your freedom, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that sort of brings me on nicely to what was in my mind as the next sort of logical step, and also transitioning us into the latter parts of this part where things take a more sort of historical turn, I suppose. Because there is, Marx kind of hints at a sort of like, there is a historical transition into full capitalism, I suppose, where stemming from this sort of twofold, what he describes as the twofold character of labour, which is the labour which produces the use value and the labour which produces the value.
Sure.
Or like the concrete labour and the abstract labour. He sort of seems to describe a historical process whereby producers are sort of producing these two types of labour potentially. But I suppose initially you can imagine a situation where people are producing primarily for use values, and then they have a certain surplus, and then they exchange that on the market kind of thing. But what he suggests happens is there is this process whereby we've already come across the idea, right? The transition to capitalism is the process whereby production is done purely for exchange and no longer for personal use kind of thing. So he's talking about even though producers are even under full capitalism, as we might describe it, like producers are still concerned with the utility that goes into making the thing, because they still need to produce products of utility. their primary concern, even in the realm of what he's calling like material production or the material relations of production, even in that realm, there what becomes preeminent is actually how much exchange value are you producing in this process, kind of thing. So I suppose to some extent, like you could imagine, coming back to freedom, like there is greater freedom in a process of production whereby all the people who are working in that production are knowingly working to produce objects of utility, which either serve their own utility or the utility of the people who will end up using them, kind of thing.
Sure.
They are consciously contributing useful products to the total pool of useful products being produced, and therefore you can attach some sort of meaning to your labor, the labor that you do, as it relates to the sort of like total social labor kind of thing, in a way which you cannot really do under capitalism, because you have no relationship to the total social labor. It's only the products that you make as products for exchange that have any kind of like connection to a wider network of laborers when they are exchanged, kind of thing. And so yeah, I don't know.
No, yeah,
that's the free and equal producers, right, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like you produce freely rather than under the constraint of having to produce to service the commodity, kind of thing, service the wills and whims of the commodity.
Kick this commodity's ass when I see it. God damn it.
I know, because it does. Maybe I take back what I said before. Like it does have real material power. It is a real thing.
Sure. Yeah.
We can blame it for social ills because even if that is a type of fetishism, commodity fetishism is a real material force in our lives. It's not a peculiar mystification of our brains.
Yeah.
It is that, but
sure. But it's both. Why not? It's
Both.
dialectic.
It's both. It's relational, folks.
It's relational.
If I've learned anything from this, it's
all
social. Everything's a social relation.
It's all relational. Let me just hit you with 2 sentences real quick about, now that we're talking about historical processes. Marx says the mode of production in which the product takes the form of a commodity or is produced directly for exchange is the most general and embryonic form of bourgeois production. It therefore makes an appearance at an early date in history, though not in the same predominating and characteristic manner as nowadays, which it's interesting. I mean, I'm not to imply that E.P. Thompson or Ellen Meeksons would do this, but since we've read the kind of origin of capitalism stuff, I've been thinking obviously a lot about the origin of capitalism and about if there is ever like, now it's capitalism. Like, is there a second where you can go, okay, it's capitalism? And I mean, obviously, if we want to develop a critique of capitalism, we need to define what capitalism is and perhaps when it started. But it's interesting here, him saying, just in those 2 sentences, which I might be, should have perhaps quoted a bit more around it to explain this. But I mean, like, just in those 2 sentences, he makes it seem obviously as much more of a process and a longer process at that, right? The development of capitalism. And he basically, one thing that I found really refreshing was him just basically saying, you can point to things in a mode where you perhaps wouldn't point to it and be like, that's capitalism, but like, these are proto-capitalist forms. And it made the idea of trying to decide on when capitalism started sit a lot better in my head, just because it was defined as a process and not one of just like an immediate like enclosures. They put a fence around that land, you know what I mean? And so I don't know, I really appreciated thinking of it as a process. I didn't expect that to be in the commodity of fetishism.
Yeah, it's difficult, that quote, isn't it? I don't, because you, maybe he is sowing the type of ambiguity that you're appreciating to some extent by just saying an early date in history. Exactly.
And it's like been such a big debate ever since then of like, well, when did it happen? England's the worst island on the planet.
But yeah, there are sections in this where he's talking about other modes of production whereby, well, maybe I'll just read the whole thing. In the ancient Asiatic and other ancient modes of production, we find that the conversion of products into commodities, and therefore the conversion of men into producers of commodities, holds a subordinate place. So he's saying that like commodity production can be seen in other modes of production,
sure,
but it doesn't become the preeminent mode of production. It doesn't become the preeminent goal of productive activity, kind of thing. we've talked about this before, like the relationship between, I find it very interesting and compelling, like the relationship between continuity and change, right? And it's something we're really going to have to grapple with if we're going to imagine a transition to another mode of production. Like,
Sure.
how much continuity can we bear? And this is also the essential part of the essential reason to analyze capitalism so closely is to work out really which are the totally essential features that we really need to attack straight away, and which are the kind of like byproducts, or which are the sort of supplementary features which we can perhaps tolerate for longer, I suppose. Or how can you develop a really sort of pointed attack, particularly if you're trying to do something whereby, particularly if you're planning like an actual sort of conscious intervention, what can you plan to do which would be consciously comprehensible, I suppose, by bourgeois subjects, as we all are, but also change enough of the essential features to set us on a different path, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point about identifying what needs to be attacked straight away in terms of capitalism, and what it are like, I'm not going to say good things, but what are, like, obviously, we've talked about this in our Council of Communism episode about the idea of like the level of productivity that capitalism has been able to create, and about, Marx believing that the ideas about, socialism rising out of that kind of mass productivity, what needs to be replaced, what are the real problems that are creating this commodity fetishism, that are creating this kind of alienation, and what aren't, I suppose. I would like to know a bit more. I laughed when he said that Protestantism is the most fitting form of religion for capitalism. I'd like to know a bit more about what he meant by that.
But Christianity in general, I suppose, is what he's saying.
Sure, yeah. But he's like, Protestantism, that's where it's at.
I like it as like it's a sort of almost like a preemptive attack on Max Weber.
Yeah.
Now, I don't really know very much about like Weber, only the basics of like the Protestant work. What's it called? The Origins of Capitalism, Protestant work ethic.
Yeah.
But like here, Marx seems to be very explicitly saying that these sort of like social mystifications that are religious beliefs are produced as appropriate reflections of the mode of production, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Like, I suppose the Weberian suggestion is that, like, and maybe Weber's not saying this, maybe a crude understanding of Weber would be to say that capitalism came about after the sort of Protestant work ethic developed, whereas what an equally crude understanding of Marx and Marxism might say is that Puritanism and Protestantism only have their appeal once the sort of like transition to the capitalist mode of production is underway, not the other way around. Yeah, exactly.
Once again, Quakerism, much like Zinch.
What?
I'm not going to say that Quakerism is the official religion of communism. I won't go that far. Was there anything else you wanted to cover in this commodity fetishism idea? Relatively simple idea, but as with kind of everything in this first chapter, the extrapolations that you can make and the implications of it are many. There are a lot. And would you look at that, Dan? I don't know when we started, but we finished chapter 1.
Chapter 1.
We finished a
4
chapter.
episodes down.
Holy crap.
So we've read chapter 1 of 28 chapters.
Oh, no.
In Capital Volume 1, of which we've read 1.
In 20,
I feel
55,
accomplished. I feel
accomplished too. It's more than I've ever read in my, I'm going to read Capital. So, look at us. We did it. We got past the first chapter.
Yeah.
Chapter 2.
Very short.
It's very short, and it's the process of exchange. And Harvey begins that by saying it's not only shorter, but it's easier to follow. Whew. Thank goodness.
Maybe we'll get to it quite quickly then.
Yeah, let's hope so. We'll get there, folks. Thanks if you are still listening. Thank you. Capital, good stuff.
Yeah.
That's all I got to say.
Yeah, read it yourselves.
Yeah, read it yourselves. You bastards.
What do we know?
Yeah. Well, if you've listened this far, you probably know. All right, well, I've been Jack. We'll be back with a classic weekly episode for you on Friday. It's going to be a banger. I'm saying that right now.
Stop promising, Jack.
See you. It'll be good. music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you liked what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.